Hey guys, tonight we slip through the shadows of cobblestone alleys into a world that smells like warm flour, smoldering wood, and the faintest trace of sleep deprivation. You're in a medieval village, somewhere in Europe, and the stars are still high overhead. The sun? Nowhere to be found. The roosters haven't even cleared their throats yet, but someone's already working. You're headed to the bakery, which is, depending on how much you value your sleep, the most cursed or most noble building in town. It's not much to look at from the outside, just a squat structure pressed between taller timber-framed homes with a crooked chimney and a door slightly ajar to release the heat. Inside, it's alive. Soft candlelight flickers against soot-blackened beams. The floor is dusted with flour. And the air? The air is thick with the quiet huff of a fire that's never allowed to die. You step inside, and the warmth wraps around you like a quilt. It's crowded, not with people. There are only a few here, but with movement. Wooden paddles scrape against stone. Dough thuds softly against oak counters, and in the far corner, someone stirs a slurry in a clay basin that looks suspiciously like it hasn't been cleaned since last week. Don't worry, that's on purpose. The head baker, face smudged and hands caked, glances up and nods. He's wearing what passes for a uniform, a linen shirt, rolled up at the sleeves, a stained apron tied twice at the waist, and a look of mild irritation that's probably been there since midnight. His assistant, barefoot, younger, and barely awake, keeps yawning between batches. You watch as he leans on a sack of flour for a moment, maybe too long, then jolts upright as if even thinking about sleep might get him scolded. And here's the kicker. It's not even 3 a.m. So why are they up? Because if the dough isn't mixed, kneaded, rested, and rising by sunrise, then there's no bread when the town wakes up. And in a place where bread is the backbone of survival, seriously, they used it as currency in some tax systems. You don't want to be the one explaining to the villagers that breakfast has been canceled, especially when those villagers include knights, clergy, and that one very aggressive goose lady. You step closer to the prep table. The dough here is thick, sticky, and living. You can see it slowly pulling in on itself, ballooning slightly with every breath of fermentation. It's hypnotic and strangely warm. And that's part of tonight's mystery. Because once upon a time, bakers didn't just shape their loaves and tuck them away. They slept with them. Okay, not like that, but they slept near them, next to them, around them. In some cases, literally using them as pillows. Well, sacks of it. The idea sounds absurd now, some kind of yeasty fairy tale, but it was rooted in real need. Temperature mattered, time mattered, and back before climate-controlled proofers and precision yeast, a good batch of dough could be ruined just by a cold snap or a mistimed nap. So what did bakers do? They curled up on the warm stone floor, or on a bench near the oven, or even with the dough itself, wrapped in cloth like a baby. They watched it. They listened for it. They rose when it rose. This wasn't just baking, it was bread keeping. And if you're already thinking, that sounds exhausting, well, yeah, it was. But before we get to the whole bakers as human thermometers thing, there's something poetic about this early moment. The hush, the rhythm, the idea that while the rest of the world sleeps, someone's already up, shaping the day, feeding it, literally. You glance again at the flickering fire, the stacks of shaped loaves proofing near the embers, and the assistant now sitting cross-legged beside them, nodding off with his head near the rising dough. A kind of living alarm clock. And here's your CTA before we settle in fully. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment below with where you're tuning in from and what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The assistant shifts in his seat, one eye half open, the other dreaming of a bed that probably doesn't exist. You step closer to the mixing table, where the baker is elbow deep in something that looks like an ooze with ambition. It's flour and water, sure, but also something more alive. Something that, if left alone too long, either becomes bread or a disaster. Midnight is when it begins. Not the actual baking, that comes later, but the mixing. Because this is no 5-minute affair. This is a carefully orchestrated, body-powered ritual. You don't get bread by simply combining ingredients and waiting. You get it by working, waiting, checking, kneading, folding, and waiting again. It's a cycle, one dictated not by clocks, but by instinct. By touch, the baker grunts as he lifts a bowl the size of a small cauldron. The dough slops into a wooden trough lined with linen. He sprinkles a handful of flour over it and folds the cloth, like tucking in a child. Then he sighs and leans back against the wall, eyes on the shape beneath the linen. This is where the phrase, watching dough rise, becomes less about boredom and more about duty. Because you can't wander off. You can't leave it unattended. You can't forget it. Especially in a medieval kitchen where a flicker in oven heat or an unexpected draft could shift the entire outcome. So what do? You wait. And sometimes, while waiting, you nap. Right there on the bench. Or the sack. Or, if it's winter, right next to the dough itself, sharing your body heat like a baker-shaped hot water bottle. It sounds weird, but in a time before thermostats and thermometers, human warmth was a critical part of fermentation control. You glance at the assistant again. He's now curled near a batch wrapped in damp cloth, his head resting on the edge of the proofing bench. Every so often, he lifts the linen, checks the air bubbles, and goes back to dreaming. Midnight mixing wasn't just about prepping early. It was about precision timing. Dough mixed too soon would overproof. Mixed too late? It wouldn't rise in time for morning sales. Add to that the ambient temperature, the humidity of the air, the freshness of the flour, and the strain of wild yeast being used, and you've got a juggling act with no safety net. And there's one more complication. They didn't know why it worked. Not exactly. Medieval bakers hadn't isolated yeast. They hadn't discovered microbes. To them, the dough's rise was something between alchemy and faith. So when they slept near it, when they hovered, when they whispered to each other about the feel of the mix, it wasn't just monitoring. It was reverence, a relationship, like watching a tide come in or keeping a vigil over something you don't fully understand, but trust anyway. Here's a quirky fact to tuck under your baker's cap. In some towns, bakers were forbidden by local guilds to leave the bakery while dough was rising. The risk of failure was considered too high. So you stayed, all night, even if it meant dozing beside the oven or on a bag of rye. And speaking of guilds, historians still argue whether these mixing schedules were universally enforced or more like strong recommendations. Some scrolls show heavy fines for under-fermented bread. Others imply it was more about maintaining consistency and honor than exact legality. Either way, if your loaves didn't rise, your status sank. The midnight hour is now giving way to the creeping suggestion of dawn. Not full light, just a graying of the sky through a tiny soot-smeared window. The baker perks up slightly. He rolls his shoulders and approaches the dough with a tired reverence. He touches it, presses it lightly, smells it. Then he nods. "Ready," he mutters. You don't know if he's talking to the assistant, to you, or to the dough itself. But it doesn't matter. The next phase is coming, and with it, another set of rhythms: shaping, second proofing, heating the oven, the first bake. But for now, there's a lull, a quiet, the kind that only exists between major efforts, a breath between actions, a moment where sleep might almost creep in. If the dough doesn't shift, you settle against a flour sack and watch the scene unfold with a softness you didn't expect. This isn't frantic labor, it's more like a vigil. And in this sleepy haze of candlelight, flour dust, and gentle fermentation, you realize something strange. There's something deeply peaceful about it, even sacred. The warmth of the bakery wraps itself around your shoulders like a second cloak, and you start to feel what the assistant must be feeling, an irresistible pull toward dozing off next to something slow, warm, and breathing in floury little puffs. You glance over at the dough, still tucked beneath linen, and wonder, is it really necessary to sleep with it? Yes, for a long time it absolutely was. Here's why. Dough is fussy, especially pre-modern dough. It doesn't rise on command. It responds to a delicate ballet of temperature, moisture, and microbes in the air. Those magical, invisible yeasts that float into the flour from the world around them. And unlike commercial yeast today, these little wild organisms don't like the cold. They don't like surprise drafts. They don't like being neglected. So what do you do if your bakery is made of stone, the oven hasn't warmed the room yet, and it's the middle of a medieval winter? You become the heater. And by you, we mean the baker, the assistant, maybe even the baker's wife or child. In some traditions, people took turns staying close to the dough throughout the night, sometimes even sleeping on the table beside it or curled around the bowl. This wasn't for comfort. This was strategy. You wrap your arms around your knees and lean closer to the bench, where the dough, now shaped into rounded loaves, is resting again. A second rise, an important one, and it's still chilly in the room despite the nearby oven beginning to grumble. So the assistant throws a wool cloth over the tray. He sits close, maybe not touching, but radiating just enough heat to nudge the dough upward. Some bakers took this even further. In colder months, they'd create a kind of nest of warmth. Cloth, coals at a safe distance, layers of insulation, and then sleep in that nest with the dough in the center. They'd share breath with it. Some folklore even described this moment as keeping the loaf alive. It wasn't scientific, but it worked. And it worked because dough rises best in gentle warmth. No sharp changes, no sudden cold, just steady, slow fermentation. And if the weather couldn't be trusted, the baker's body would step in. Literally. Now, before you imagine some cozy fairy tale of bread snuggling, remember, these were long, physically grueling nights. The warmth of a loaf was balanced by the ache of hands, the smoke of the fire, the weight of responsibility. One ruined batch could mean empty stomachs the next morning, not just for customers, but for the baker's own family. So yes, sometimes they slept beside their dough, because sometimes they couldn't afford not to. And here's your quirky historical nugget. In some northern regions of Europe, bakers developed special bread blankets. Yes, actual cloths made to retain heat and moisture during the night. These were woven thick, sometimes with waxed layers to trap warmth. A few even had herbs like rosemary or bay sewn into the edges, partly for scent, partly as pest deterrents. Sleeping under one of those? That's peak medieval multitasking. Historians still argue whether this sleeping with the dough practice was widespread or only emerged in colder climates. Some suggest it was born out of necessity in unheated village bakehouses. Others think it might have started in monastic bakeries, where schedules were rigid and results had to be perfect, meaning monks would have gladly sacrificed a bit of rest for a flawless pre-dawn rise. Back in your bakery, the assistant has nodded off again, this time with his shoulder gently resting against the proofing board. The baker watches for a moment, says nothing. Maybe he's been there too. Maybe this is part of the rhythm. There's no ticking clock here, no smartphone alarms, just the rise of the dough, the crackle of the fire, the knowledge passed down from hands to hands, like a song you learn by heart, not because someone wrote it down, but because you've heard it every day of your life. And still, in this moment, you can almost feel the dough breathing, not literally, of course, but rising, stretching, exhaling as it takes shape. It is a living thing, and living things need care, which brings us to the heart of it all. Bread wasn't just food, it was sustenance, symbol, sacrament. It needed to be perfect. And if that meant a few hours of sleep stolen beside a warm bowl of bubbling flour water, so be it. You shift slightly and let your gaze linger on the assistant's sleeping form, the linen-covered dough slowly lifting beside him like the chest of a child in sleep. For now, everything is still, almost, because in a few minutes the fire will roar, the loaves will go in, and the cycle will start again. The baker moves with quiet urgency now, a kind of sleepy choreography that has been practiced so many times it might as well be muscle memory. He lifts a corner of linen, gently prods the dough with 2 fingers, and grunts softly. Approval, maybe, or fatigue. Either way, it's time for the next step. You lean in. The smell is changing. It's richer now, deeper, more like bread and less like flour. That's the wild yeast at work. But here's the kicker. No one in this room knows what yeast actually is. They call it leaven, sometimes God's breath. In some regions, they believe it lives in the air, a kind of invisible spirit that chooses whether to bless your dough or leave it flat and sad. And technically, they're not wrong. You watch as the assistant stirs a separate batch in a basin set near the hearth. This one is more like a paste, almost frothy. That's the starter, the magical goop made from flour and water left out to collect wild yeast over several days. It smells sour, a little like apples, a little like socks, and exactly like future bread. You've probably heard of sourdough. Well, here's its medieval ancestor, bubbling in the corner like a potion. And now comes the real fun, maintenance. Keeping this starter alive means feeding it daily, sometimes twice a day. You add flour, a little water, stir, wait, hope. It's basically a pet, one that smells weird and can ruin your week if it dies. And you guessed it, bakers often slept near their starters too, especially in winter, because if the starter went cold, the yeast went dormant. Or worse, it died. And if that happened, you weren't just losing a batch, you were starting all over. That's why some bakers carried a bit of starter with them at all times, tucked in a pouch, sealed in wax, smuggled like a secret. There are even records of dowries including a jar of healthy starter passed down from mother to daughter. Love, bread, and good fermentation, 3 essentials of a stable household. Historians still argue whether this practice of sleeping near the starter was deliberate strategy or just a consequence of living and working in the same cramped quarters. Some believe it was a practical adaptation. Others think it became part of baker folklore, almost a superstition. If the starter sleeps cold, your loaves will fold. You know, that kind of thing. In fact, there are medieval writings that describe bakers whispering to their starters. No joke. Actual whispered blessings, prayers, or chants. Not because they believed the dough had ears, but because, in a way, it was alive. And treating it with care and ritual made sense in a world where most things were unpredictable, brutal, and short-lived. Back in the bakery, the assistant is carefully spooning a bit of the starter into a new bowl. He covers it, wipes his hands, and glances at the coals. They're glowing now, the fire building for the morning bake. And in this soft glow, you catch the shape of a loaf nearby, proofed, risen, ready. The baker lifts it with both hands and nods to himself. Perfect, he mutters. The oven itself is an enormous domed structure made from stone and clay. There's no dial, no thermometer, just instinct and scars from burns past. You watch as the baker tosses in a handful of flour. It flares, then smolders. He nods, hot enough. He moves quickly now, sliding the first loaves in with a long-handled peel. The assistant begins counting, out loud this time, softly, like a chant. Not seconds, not minutes, just awareness. Because here's the thing, even though they don't have clocks, they do have timing. Some bakers used candles with marked notches. Others relied on incense sticks. A few had clepsydras, water clocks, to track the stages. But most relied on rhythm, on repetition, on the feel of time rather than the measurement of it. And that's what makes this whole process so fascinating. They didn't know about yeast. They didn't understand microbiology. But they figured out how to work with nature anyway. How to partner with invisible forces using only their senses, their hands, and yes, their body heat. You sit back now as the scent of baking bread begins to bloom. It's rich, nutty, slightly sour, the kind of smell that makes you close your eyes and forgive the world for a little while. And somewhere, probably tomorrow, someone will eat that loaf and never think twice about how it came to be. They'll never know that it was shaped by two sleepy bakers under candlelight, that it rose beside a body to stay warm, that it was stirred with a whisper, that it came to life not through science, but through sleeplessness and devotion. But you'll know. And tonight, as the oven door closes and the baker wipes his brow, you realize something beautiful. Bread isn't born in fire. It's born in the quiet before it. The bakery feels warmer now, not just from the oven's rising heat, but from the sense of something completed. The first round of loaves is in. The room smells like trust, like history, like 1,000 tiny chemical miracles playing out in dough. You stretch your back and notice the assistant is stirring again, but this time it's not dough. It's ash and cinders, scraped carefully from the side of the oven with a long iron rod. He does it gently, not to disturb the heat. Just enough to clear the floor, just enough to reset for the next batch. There's rhythm in it. Not haste, not panic. Rhythm. And that's the secret. Baking wasn't chaotic. It was a night-long, body-tempered, yeast-guided symphony. And every player knew their cue. The baker moves with a kind of sleepy elegance now. He's not rushing. He doesn't need to. He's timed it all perfectly. Not with a watch, but with his bones. With the sound of the coals. The way the dough shivers under a fingertip. The color of the flour on the table. This is ancient timekeeping. Not by seconds, by signs. You walk to the back wall where a small niche holds a few blackened tools. A stone scoop, an oil lamp with soot stains, a cloth roll tied neatly shut. One tool is clearly important. It's a wooden stick with faint notches down the side. A primitive baking gauge. Here's your quirky tidbit of the hour. Some medieval bakers made breadsticks not to bake, but to time their baking. Each notch marked a moment, based not on minutes, but phases of the loaf. One notch for when to rotate, another for when to vent the oven. a third when the crust should start to blister. Historians still argue whether these sticks were common across regions or more like family heirlooms passed down from baker to baker. Some even had burn marks as tactile cues, so you didn't need to look, just feel. And while we're here, let's talk about night. Because for bakers, night wasn't rest, it was the work shift. It was quiet, yes, but never empty. In fact, many medieval towns had curfews, bells that rang at dusk telling everyone to douse lights and stay indoors. But not bakers. They were exempt. In some cities, they were the only citizens allowed to walk the streets after curfew, usually with a lantern and proof of guild membership, because if they didn't work, the town didn't eat. So while the rest of the village snored, the bakery glowed, like a tiny heart keeping the whole body alive. And here comes the moment that earns tonight's title. The assistant slides onto a straw mat again, tucking his knees to his chest. Next to him, another bowl of dough rests under a wool blanket. It's smaller this time, probably for rolls or biscuits, but it still matters. And yes, he leans close. Not full body contact, just a shared corner of warmth. That's what sleeping with the dough really meant. Proximity, protection, temperature control born out of necessity. It wasn't romantic, it wasn't cozy, it was logistical, and, in a strange way, tender. You sit on a low bench and listen to the fire, to the faint bubbling of starter in its clay pot, to the quiet exhale of breath as the baker sharpens his lame, a razor used to score the tops of rising loaves. Each cut is an opening, not just for style, but function, to let steam escape, to shape the crumb, to signal identity. Some bakers even carved family symbols into their loaves, a recognizable slash for each household, so customers could spot their favorite even before the crust browned. And yes, there were contests. Loaf beauty mattered. Imagine a town square at dawn, dozens of vendors with baskets of bread, some marked with elegant curves, some rough and rugged. The best sellers weren't always the prettiest, but the prettiest almost always sold. Back inside, the baker reaches for the peel again. The first round is nearly done. He leans into the oven, pulls one loaf halfway out, taps the bottom with a knuckle. It sounds hollow. Done. He lifts it gently, places it on a cooling rack made of woven reed. The loaf hisses softly, crust contracting from the sudden chill. You can almost hear it sigh. This loaf began as a handful of grain, ground by millstone, mixed under moonlight, risen beside a sleeping boy, and baked just in time for the town to open its eyes. And tomorrow, someone will tear it in half, butter it, eat it, and never once think of how close it came to not existing at all. Because good bread isn't guaranteed, it's earned. Through sleepless nights, through fingertips burned and noses dusted in flour, through warmth shared with bowls instead of blankets. And if that meant sleeping beside it, then so be it. You're still perched on that low bench, watching steam rise gently from the cooling rack, when a rooster crows somewhere in the distance. Not loudly, not triumphantly, but sleepily, as if even the birds aren't quite ready to face the day. But the bakery is ahead of it. The bread is baked, the tools wiped down, and the assistant is stirring once more. Not flour, not dough, but something darker and thinner. Grain coffee. It smells like roasted barley and wood smoke, and it isn't exactly delicious, but after a night beside the oven, it's fuel. You take a slow breath and feel the shift in the room. The work is done, the product finished. And now, the ritual begins, waiting for the town to wake up. Because bakers weren't just nighttime artisans, they were dawn's heralds. Before the bells, before the prayers, before the shops opened their shutters, the smell of bread was already curling through the streets, summoning feet to cobblestone. And here's where things get interesting. In many medieval towns, bakers didn't actually own their flour. Not entirely. They were bound to mills, controlled by lords, monasteries, or guilds, and flour came pre-measured, taxed, inspected, and often watered down. You didn't get to choose your wheat. You worked with what you were given, which made consistency hard, especially when the flour quality changed week to week, season to season. So what did bakers do? They adapted, with touch. You watch the baker press his thumb into a fresh lump of dough, not to test, but to remember. This flour is slightly coarser than yesterday's, slightly thirstier. It will take longer to hydrate. It will rise slower. The starter needs a longer fermentation window, and so the baking time must shift. No clocks, no timers, just intuition. And if that sounds romantic, remember, it was also risky. If your bread didn't bake properly, you could be fined. Medieval baking regulations were shockingly strict. In Paris, there were inspectors, called bread watchers, who roamed the city checking weight, shape, and size. If a loaf was underweight, the baker could be fined or worse, publicly shamed. And for repeat offenders, their loaves were nailed to their bakery door as a warning to customers. Don't buy here. This bread cheats you. Harsh? Maybe. But bread wasn't just food. It was currency. If it failed, society cracked. That's why bakers became obsessive, not in a frantic way, but in a quiet, precise, methodical way. That's why they memorized every batch. That's why they slept beside the dough. Because perfection wasn't optional. Your quirky fact for the hour. In some cities, bakers were required by law to bake a special test loaf from each batch. These test loaves weren't sold, they were inspected, weighed, sliced open to judge the crumb. Some guilds kept detailed logs of test loaf results, centuries of rise and fall ratios recorded by candlelight. Historians still argue whether these logs were purely administrative or whether they served as secret teaching tools for apprentice bakers. Some claim they were used to train the next generation. Others think they were mostly for tax records. Either way, they were treated with surprising reverence, tomes of flour and fire. You rise now, stretch your legs, and follow the assistant to the front of the shop, a narrow wooden counter with a sliding panel. He lifts it open and sets the first loaves on display. A row of round golden wheels, slightly cracked tops, charred bottoms, honest bread. Outside, the sky has lightened into pearl gray. A few figures shuffle past, traders, clergy, a woman carrying a wicker basket over one arm. They don't rush, but they glance in. They notice. And slowly, without fanfare, the first customer appears. She's elderly, wrapped in layers. Her hands are cracked from work. She reaches into her pocket and pulls out a coin. A thin, battered disc. She points at one of the loaves. The assistant nods, wraps it in cloth, and hands it over. No words, but you can tell this is her ritual too. She's not just buying food, she's buying reliability, a loaf that rose beside another human being, that lived its little life beside a fire, that survived the night. You step aside to let others gather at the window. A boy with a linen pouch, a tired man with calloused hands. No one's here for spectacle, just warmth, just nourishment. And that's the lesson. These loaves aren't magical. They're not award-winning. They're not perfect by modern standards. But they're loved, made with care, protected like fragile little creatures until they rose just enough to feed a village. And if that meant sacrificing sleep, curling beside a bowl, humming to a jar of bubbling starter, or whispering to a steaming loaf in the dark, then so be it. Because time in a medieval bakery wasn't kept on a clock. It was kept on the body. When the baker blinked slower, it was midnight. When the dough exhaled gently under linen, it was ready. When the oven smelled of smoke and stone, it was baking time. And when the rooster crowed and the coins clinked, it was morning. You're still standing in the doorway of the shop now, warm bread scent curling into the street like a gentle net catching early risers. The baker leans on his elbows, eyes half closed, not from boredom, but from exhaustion. The kind that comes not from rushing, but from caring, from waking before the town, from sleeping in shifts, curled around bowls instead of pillows. And this moment right here, is what the night was all for. The window is open, the loaves are ready, and people come, one by one, holding out their hands like offerings, as if the bread will bless them back. In a way, it does. You watch a young girl reach up shyly. Her mother hands her a copper coin and whispers something. The girl places it on the counter. The assistant, still dusted in flour, passes down a small roll wrapped in linen. She holds it like a treasure. This is the quiet economy of trust. Bread for coin, warmth for patience. But here's a little secret. Not all bakers did it the same way. In fact, medieval Europe was full of regional quirks and customs when it came to baking. Some towns swore by sourdough. Others used beer barm, foam from the top of fermenting ale, as a leavening agent. That's right. If you've ever had ale bread, it was literally beer infused from the beginning. And because the yeast strains varied wildly, bakers sometimes traded their starters, like medieval Pokemon. I'll give you a northern rye ferment for your southern oat sponge. It wasn't just sharing, it was adapting, expanding their craft, stretching what bread could be. You glance back inside and spot a clay jar with a wax seal tucked high on a shelf. It's older than the rest. Maybe it came from another town. Maybe it's the prized starter, fed and guarded for decades, passed from master to apprentice like sacred flame. Historians still argue whether these starters had names. There are scattered records with poetic references. The quiet one, breadmaker's heart, even child of the flame. Whether literal or metaphorical, it speaks to how intimate this relationship was. A baker and their ferment were a team. No one else would understand its quirks, its appetite, its sulks, its rise. And when the starter failed, when it bubbled wrong or refused to rise, it wasn't just a technical issue. It was a betrayal. Like a pet going silent, some bakers even held funerals for them, burying them outside the bakery with herbs and whispered apologies. Not common, but not unheard of. Quirky? Sure. But when your livelihood, your reputation, rests on invisible bubbles in a bowl, a little superstition starts to sound like wisdom. You step back into the room as the last few loaves come from the oven, set down with care beside the others. The assistant yawns. The baker gives him a soft tap on the shoulder and gestures to the mat in the corner. Rest now. The shift is flipped. And that's another thing most people forget. Baking wasn't solitary. Yes, some bakers worked alone, especially in smaller villages. But in towns and cities, they were often part of guilds. Organized, regulated groups that maintained quality, trained apprentices, and controlled pricing. These guilds weren't optional. Want to open a bakery? You joined the guild, learned the code, followed the hours, paid your dues. And those hours? Brutal. Start at midnight, end by late morning, then prep for the next day. No weekends, no holidays, just the relentless rhythm of the rising loaf. You walk through a side room now, smaller, quieter. A few unfinished doughs rest beneath cloth. A logbook sits open on a table, ink drying beside a reed pen. It's not fancy, just scribbled notes. Third day, starter slower, weather too dry, flour batch from mill stiffer than last. Customer asked for sweeter crust. It's a diary, really, not for posterity, but survival. So the next day doesn't start from scratch. So the memory doesn't vanish with the morning fire. Because that's what baking is, memory made edible. And you're starting to feel it now, the warmth in the soles of your feet from the stone floor, the way your breath catches slightly from the yeast-rich air, the subtle joy of seeing something simple, flour, water, salt, transformed into sustenance by time, heat, and human hands. You glance back at the assistant, already dozing, and the baker, still upright, still watching the loaves. He doesn't smile, but he doesn't need to. He knows. The job is done. The bread is good. And that's enough. There's something deeply human about this. Something that doesn't change no matter the century. We bake, we wait, we feed others. We sleep beside the dough not because it's convenient, but because it matters. Because that warmth means tomorrow's bread. And tomorrow's bread means the world goes on. The first light of morning stretches across the rooftops now, touching the chimney tops and slate tiles like a blessing. Outside the bakery, the street has begun to pulse, not with the loud rush of modern traffic, but with the soft shuffle of leather soles and the creak of wooden carts. You step outside for a moment, and the air smells of dew, chimney soot, and still bread. The village is stirring, but you don't leave the bakery just yet. You turn back, slipping inside, past the sleepy assistant, past the resting peel and ash-dusted oven floor. You're drawn instead to a small alcove carved into the wall, where a bundle of old tools hangs from wooden pegs. These aren't for baking, not anymore. They're ceremonial, kept for tradition, a reminder of the craft's roots. One of the pegs holds a tiny metal weight, no larger than your thumb. It's dark with age, worn smooth. This, you learn, was used by medieval bakers to calibrate dough portions, especially when fines were involved. Because as funny as it sounds, loaves could be weighed in court. And if they came in light, you had explaining to do. In fact, the assize of bread and ale, a medieval English law enacted in the 13th century, was one of the earliest consumer protection laws on record. It set fixed prices for loaves based on grain costs and required bakers to keep bread within a certain weight range. Too light, and you were fined. Too heavy? Well, you just lost profit. So bakers got clever. They began adding the baker's dozen, an extra roll or small loaf tossed in for free, just in case their math was off. Better to over-deliver than get hauled before a city warden. That's where the phrase comes from. Not generosity, caution. And while historians still argue whether this practice was codified or informal, some say it varied widely by region. One thing is clear. Trust in bread was a big deal. It wasn't just a matter of taste. It was a matter of fairness, of integrity. You glance toward the front window. The baker is handing out another warm loaf. No waits today, no inspectors, just the ritual, the reputation. Back in the corner, the assistant stirs, yawns, and reaches for a chipped wooden mug. He pours water into it, then dunks a piece of stale bread inside. Not the glamorous breakfast of kings, but something simpler. Sops, the medieval staple. Bread softened in water or broth, sometimes with herbs or cheese if you were lucky. It wasn't indulgence, it was fuel. And if you think that sounds grim, think again. For many in the Middle Ages, bread wasn't filler. It was the foundation. Entire meals were built around it. In fact, trenchers, thick slabs of stale bread, were used as edible plates. You'd pile food on top, and when the meal was done, you could eat the trencher, or toss it to the poor, or the dogs. You sit near the doorway now, just watching. It's peaceful, a kind of silence that doesn't feel empty, but full of breath, of movement, of quiet success. And here's your quirky tidbit of the hour. In some regions, bakers were believed to have healing hands, not because of magic, because of familiarity. Their hands were clean, constantly washed, and always warm. When a baby was sick or a joint ached, some villagers would ask a baker to touch the spot, believing their heat and rhythm, infused with yeast and fire, held curative power. Maybe it worked. Maybe it didn't. But it says something about how bakers were viewed, not just workers, but keepers of warmth, givers of calm, protectors of early light. You reach for a roll resting on the bench nearby. It's small, dense, slightly uneven, no perfect rise, no uniform crust, but it smells right, alive, honest, the kind of food that doesn't try to impress. It just tries to nourish. You take a bite. The crust crunches slightly. The inside is soft, sour, chewy, and for a moment, you understand why someone would give up their nights for this. Not because it's lucrative, not because it's glorious, but because it's real. There's something grounding about bread. You mix it. You wait. You trust. And if it doesn't rise, you try again. That's not just baking. That's life. And if you think bakers didn't feel that, you'd be wrong. Many left behind letters and diaries. Rare, yes, but real. Scraps of parchment with lines like, "Loaf fell again. I blame the wind." Or, "Customer said crust too bitter. Used less ash." Even, "Dreamed last night I kneaded forever. Woke up and my arms hurt." You smile. That's the heartbeat of this craft, not perfection, not acclaim, persistence. The bread you're eating now came from someone's patience, someone's sweaty palms and flour-covered elbows and soot-stained apron, someone who slept in snatches, checked dough in the dark, and stood barefoot on cold stone at midnight. Someone who once, just once, might have fallen asleep with a bowl beside their chest. Because warmth mattered. Because the rise mattered. Because a whole village would wake up soon, expecting the world to smell like bread. And thanks to them, it does. You wipe the crumbs from your fingers and lean back slightly, letting the warmth of the bakery wrap around you like a woolen blanket. There's a lull now. The early morning rush has passed, the baskets have been filled, and the next batch of dough hasn't yet begun its rise. It's that rare pause when nothing needs doing for a few precious minutes. The baker pours himself a drink, not ale this time, but a warm herbal infusion, something bitter and earthy. He doesn't speak, but you can tell. This moment is earned. This quiet is the payoff. You sit beside him, and for a while, you both just listen to the occasional crack of the oven cooling, to the birds finally waking, to the faint laughter of children chasing each other past the shop. And then he nods toward the back wall. There, behind a shelf of stored flour sacks and empty baskets, is something unexpected. A small wooden cot, a low, narrow frame with a folded wool blanket and a straw-stuffed pillow. Yes, this is where the baker sleeps. If you're imagining a cozy bedroom upstairs with a canopy bed and flickering candlelight, think again. This is it. Right here in the same room where the fire roars and the flour dust floats. A few hours here and there, between proving and shaping and baking. Why? Because bread waits for no one. Once the dough is mixed, the timer starts. Not a literal timer, but something deeper. The living rhythm of the ferment. If you wait too long to shape it, it collapses. If you rush it, it's flat and dense. There is no wiggle room, no snooze button, just readiness. So the baker sleeps nearby, always has. In fact, throughout medieval Europe, It was common for bakers to live in the same building where they worked, often directly above or beside the bakehouse. Some even had beds built into the wall like little nooks, just wide enough to stretch out for a nap. And here's where the phrase, sleeping with your dough, comes to life. Because it wasn't metaphorical, it was survival. You picture it now. A baker curled beside the kneading bench, wrapped in linen, one ear open for the hiss of overproofing, or the shift of weight as a bowl begins to bulge and breathe. Like watching over a child, like listening to a heartbeat. Here's your quirky tidbit. Some bakers, particularly those who specialized in sourdough, would set the bowl beside their bed and press a thumb into it every few hours while half asleep. Just enough pressure to test the tension. No scales, no digital probes, just intuition through contact. Historians still argue whether this technique was widespread or anecdotal, passed down in whispers from master to apprentice. Some say it was mostly rural tradition, while others claim it persisted well into the early modern era, particularly in colder climates, where the baker's own body heat made the difference in a rising loaf. Either way, the image endures. Someone sleeping lightly, hand on a bowl, knowing when to wake not because of an alarm, but because of feel. You walk back toward the shaping bench where a new lump of dough has just been uncovered. It's soft and bloated now, alive in a way that's difficult to explain until you've seen it yourself. The baker presses a fingertip into the surface. The dent holds, then slowly fades. He nods. Time to shape. And so the cycle begins again. He dusts the bench with rye flour, coarser than wheat, slightly darker, lifts the dough gently, folds it, presses. It's not just mechanical, it's musical. There's a rhythm in it, like breath, fold, press, turn, fold, press, turn. You join him at the bench. He hands you a smaller piece, perhaps for a roll. He shows you the motion, and you try. Your fold is clumsy. The seam isn't tight enough. The dough slouches. He doesn't laugh, just presses his thumbs into your hands and does it with you. Firm, steady, patient. Now try again. You do. This time it's better. Not perfect, but better. And here's the thing. You're not just making bread. You're joining a lineage. Thousands of bakers before you, tens of thousands of loaves. Hands folded like this, bowls filled like this. Hours counted not in minutes, but in gestures. This is how time passed before the tick of the clock. Through the weight of the dough, the resistance of a fold, the sound of crust cracking in a still room. Back at the oven, the assistant stokes the fire again. The next batch will be ready soon. And you, with flour on your hands and a soft ache in your shoulders, realize something odd. You don't feel tired. Not in the usual way. You feel grounded because you've watched the sun rise through the lens of fire and flour. You've felt the quiet miracle of transformation, from grain to dough to bread. You've seen what it means to keep vigil not for glory or noise, but for nourishment. And in this medieval bakehouse, tucked behind a crooked street and a soot-darkened chimney, time itself has softened. It's no longer a ruler. It's a rhythm, one you feel in your breath, in your fingers, and in the quiet satisfaction of a loaf just shaped. The new dough is tucked gently into baskets now, lined with coarse linen, its seams hidden and top-flowered like the first light frost of autumn. You run a finger across one, soft, still warm from the shaping, rising almost imperceptibly with the room's breath. This is the part that feels like magic, even if you understand the science. The waiting, the swelling, the slow, silent promise of what's to come. The baker covers the baskets with a thick woolen cloth, not to smother, to shield. Yeast hates drafts, and the rising needs steady warmth. You imagine the dough beneath there, stretching, flexing, growing ever so slightly. And you realize for the 100th time this night how alive it is. He turns to you, then gestures to a low stool by the hearth. Sit, rest, but don't stop watching, because the most important lessons aren't taught in bursts. They settle in gradually, like steam on cool stone. There's an odd moment of peace now, filled only by the tick of embers and the soft squeak of wooden tools being tidied. This is the tempo between pulses, the breath before the next shaping, the fire before the bake. Some bakers fill this time with chores, cleaning the ashtrays, checking the grain sacks, sweeping the stone floor with a palm broom. Others just sit, because even vigilance needs rest. And now's the time to tell you something strange, or at least unexpectedly poetic. There's a medieval text, anonymous, faded, written in a mix of Latin and Middle English, that refers to bakers as those who hold time's crust. No explanation, no context, just a line buried among trade records and price tables, but it stuck. Those who hold time's crust. Historians still argue what it means. Some say it's a metaphor for sustenance, bakers holding the outer layer of society's survival. Others suggest it refers to the act of watching time rise and fall, kneaded into bread. But maybe, just maybe, it's simpler than that. Maybe it's the idea that bread is time, transformed, and the baker is the one who dares to hold it. You sip from the same bitter brew the baker poured earlier. It's sharper than you expect. There's a faint taste of dried thyme. He offers you a smile, not wide, just knowing. And then the moment shifts again. He stands, lifts the cloth. The dough has doubled. It's time. Back to the bench. More flour. This is the shaping for bake, the final stretch. He moves quickly now. This is muscle memory in action. You try to keep up. He presses, folds, seals, and sets each dough in its cradle. Some round, some oblong, a few braided, decorative. Not for show, for saints' days, for customers who left extra coin in the pot. There's a quiet pride in this, a kind of dignity. You don't need to shout about a good loaf. It speaks for itself when broken. And here comes your fringe tidbit. Some bakers would sign their bread, literally. In places like 14th century France and the Germanic states, bakers occasionally used carved stamps, wooden or clay, to mark their loaves before baking. Not like a label, more like a crest, a unique pattern, a symbol. That way, if the bread was stolen, misweighed, or underbaked, they could trace it back. Kind of like medieval accountability. But some went further. They carved prayers into the tops of loaves, hoping the steam would carry the words upward. One popular phrase, sanctifica panem istum. Bless this bread. Imagine that. A baker's hopes baked into the crust. You help slide the loaves into the oven now, using a wooden peel long enough to keep your arms from the flame. The heat is intense, not roaring, just steady. It's been fed with hardwood and watched like a dragon's breath for hours. Now it's ready. Loaf by loaf, the oven fills. And then, the door. Not a metal hatch, just a slab of stone or heavy wood pushed into place and sealed with damp clay or a rolled cloth. Because nothing about this is flashy, but everything about it is sacred. You sit back again as the loaves begin their final transformation. You can't see them anymore, but you can hear it, barely, the tiniest crackle as crust begins to form. This part always takes longer than you think, just long enough for doubt to creep in. Will they rise? Will the fire be too much? Will today be the day the batch fails? That's why the baker doesn't leave. That's why the stool stays close. That's why, when he finally does nap again, it's always within earshot. Because fire is both friend and risk. And bread is balance. Here's something fun. In some monasteries, the baker's job was so crucial, it came with extra privileges, better meals, fewer public prayers, even an assistant scribe to keep track of inventory. Why? Because no monks, no nuns, no scribes could function on an empty belly. It wasn't about status, it was about sustenance. So while others studied or copied texts, the baker ensured survival. And as the minutes pass, you understand that now too. This room smells different already. Less like dough, more like promise. The promise of crust, of heat sealed within grain. And when the baker opens the oven, just a crack, you see the glow, the rise, the golden arc. He smiles for real this time. You've done it, together. The first finished loaves come out steaming, their crusts crackling softly as they hit the cooling racks. Simple wooden slats propped near the open window, where the morning air now flows gently in. You watch the steam rise from the slits in the scored tops, curling into the light like breath exhaled after sleep. And for a second, no one moves. The baker, the assistant, even you, all just admire. Because no matter how many loaves you've made, no matter how many batches you've rotated or ovens you've stoked, this part never gets old. The moment of reveal, the miracle of crust. You lean in closer. Each loaf tells its own story. One has split slightly at the top, where the fold was too tight. Another has a perfect crown, golden and ridged. A third smells more sour. A longer ferment, perhaps. You reach out and tap one gently. The sound it makes is hollow and deep, like a drum. That's the sound of done. Bakers in the Middle Ages didn't have thermometers. They had experience. They listened. They tapped. They learned, loaf by loaf. Here's your historical fact. The term proof in bread making, still used today, comes from this very process. The proving wasn't just about rising. It was about truth. The dough had to prove it was ready, that it had risen enough, that it could hold its shape and survive the fire. You're not just cooking, you're testing trust. The assistant pulls one loaf aside and slices it, still hot, which would horrify modern artisan bakers, but here it's tradition. A hunk of butter, or maybe rendered fat, is dabbed onto the crumb, melting instantly into the steam. He hands it to you. It's chewy, slightly tangy, dense in the middle, but soft. And you think, this is what people once survived on. This is what armies carried, what children gnawed, what widows offered in church, what prisoners received in their bowls. Bread was more than food, it was identity. And here comes your quirky tidbit. In medieval Paris, there were more laws about bread than about crime. Seriously, a baker who cheated the weight of a loaf could be publicly shamed, paraded through the street with the offending bread hung around his neck. One record even describes a baker being nailed by the ear to his own door. Now, historians still argue whether that particular punishment was standard or exceptional. Some say it was rare, more symbolic than enforced. Others believe it happened often enough to keep bakers awake at night. Either way, you get the point. Bread mattered deeply, and so did the people who made it. You take another bite. It's better than the first. You let it melt on your tongue, and you realize something else. This is a moment of rest, yes, but also of beginning. Because now that the bread is done, the real work begins. Distribution. People will come soon, some with coins, others with tokens, still others on accounts kept in chalk marks on the bakery wall. There will be regulars, nobles, stable boys, young mothers with tired eyes, elderly women carrying canvas sacks, children on errands. They'll all arrive expecting their daily bread, and each will receive it not just as a product, but as a promise fulfilled. The baker begins stacking loaves into woven baskets, round ones first, then long, then the flatter, crusty discs made with more rye than wheat. The assistant ties them off with linen strips, color-coded by batch. You help. It feels good, orderly, rhythmic, like braiding purpose into the morning. And now, something beautiful happens. One of the earliest customers arrives, not someone you'd expect. A boy, no older than 9, barefooted, wearing a patched tunic and carrying a reed basket almost as big as he is. He places a wooden token on the counter and waits without speaking. The baker smiles, takes the token, hands him a half-loaf still warm. The boy nods once and runs off down the alley. That loaf? It wasn't paid for today. It was paid for last season. Or perhaps it was part of a church fund, a village tithe, or just the baker's quiet practice of feeding those who need it. No sign, no fuss, just bread given. You glance at the other loaves. Some are marked with charcoal streaks, crosses, circles, little slashes, not decorations, codes. Bread for the sick, for the shrine, for the night watch. Each one speaks. You walk outside again now, basket in hand, and see the street waking fully. The light is gentler than before, less gold, more silver. A woman sweeps her stoop, a man mends the wheel of a cart, a chicken pecks at crumbs beneath a merchant's stall. You set the basket down. People gather, not loudly, not impatiently, just present. You pass out bread, one loaf at a time, and with each hand that takes it, you feel something settle deep in your chest. Not pride, not even satisfaction, just connection, because this is what bread has always done. It feeds, yes, but more than that, it gathers. And here's a final thought before the next batch bakes. In the medieval world, people believed that breaking bread together wasn't just symbolic. It was spiritual, a pact, a peace. When you ate from the same loaf, you shared more than hunger. You shared time, trust, breath. The baker hands you another roll, nods. The cycle begins again. Another mix, another rise, another vigil. And still, you don't feel tired. You feel held by the fire, by the bread, by time itself. You dust your hands off and step back into the bakehouse where the next batch is already underway. The dough from earlier, remember? The one resting beneath the cloth, nearly forgotten in all the handing out and storytelling, has nearly doubled in size. You press a finger into its surface. It sighs back, gently holding the indentation before slowly returning to shape. Perfect. The baker gives you a knowing look, as if to say, "See, you're getting it." And you are. Not just the technique, the rhythm. Fold, press, turn. Feed the fire, rest the dough. Listen for the crackle. This is what medieval life often looked like. Not grand battles or towering cathedrals, but this. Flour on your arms, embers at your back, the sound of crust cooling. And now it's time for a little secret. All this effort, all this heat and care, it didn't just make bread, it made reputation. In towns across Europe, the baker was a central figure, not flashy, not loud, but utterly essential. You couldn't run a village without bread, and you couldn't have bread without the person who knew when the dough had proved just enough. There's even a record from 13th century York listing the baker third in civic importance, behind only the reeve and the priest. That's right. The guy elbow deep in rye was practically royalty in his neighborhood. But here's your quirky tidbit. In some towns, bakers had to swear an oath before starting their trade. An actual legal promise, hands on a holy book, to bake fairly, weigh honestly, and never sell yesterday's loaves as fresh. Historians still argue whether this was more about regulating the grain trade or protecting public health. Some believe it reflected a deep fear of famine, while others say it was about trust, about keeping the community knit together. Either way, it meant something. And you feel that now, don't you? You look at the tools, the paddle, the brush, the stamp. You look at the walls, etched with ash stains and old chalk notes, and then you look at the fire, steady and hot, like a heart that never stops beating. The baker hands you the shaping knife again. Time to score. Scoring isn't just decorative, it's a signature. It lets steam escape. It helps the loaf rise in a controlled way. And yes, it tells the world who made it. You carve your first line too deep, but it still works. The dough doesn't mind. It's forgiving. The oven is opened again, and this time you slide the bread in yourself. The peel wobbles a bit, but you manage. The door closes. The bake begins. Now, let's take a moment to talk about something odd. Sometimes, rarely, a baker would lose their feel, their sense of timing. It was called losing the hand. The loaves would fall flat. The crust wouldn't crack right. The rise was uneven. It wasn't an injury. It was something more mysterious, like a singer going hoarse. When that happened, some bakers took a day off. Others visited the church. A few asked older bakers to watch their hand, to stand nearby and observe silently until the rhythm returned. Can you imagine that? Not a teacher, not a boss, just someone watching, gently, until the timing came back. We don't really have that today. If your skill falters, it's spreadsheets, reviews, reminders. But here, you wait. You trust. You feel your way back. And that's exactly what the baker beside you is doing right now. Not because he's lost his hand, but because he's teaching you how to keep yours. He doesn't scold. He doesn't adjust your shaping. He just folds his arms, leans back, and watches. Let's pause for a thought. Time in the medieval world wasn't about alarms. It was about sequence, about repetition. That's why you could sleep beside your dough. Why you knew the sun was right just by the way it hit the oven door. Why your day wasn't counted in minutes, but in loaves. And that's what you're learning here. The bread is nearly done again. The assistant is prepping baskets. The baker scratches a few notes with a charred stick onto the beam above the oven. A reminder, maybe, of how long this batch took, or when to start the next one tomorrow. You glance at the loaves through the crack in the oven. They're rising beautifully. The crust is singing, that whisper crackle that tells you it's almost time. Another thought drifts in. How many people touched this bread before it reached someone's hands? Not just the baker, the miller who ground the grain, the farmer who planted it, the reaper who bundled it, the oxen who pulled the plow, the river that watered the fields. Bread wasn't a solo act. It was a chorus. And you? Tonight, you're part of it. You pull the finished loaves from the oven. Your arms ache. Your clothes are dusty. You're grinning like a fool. Because it worked. Because something about this feels older than the walls around you. The baker nods once. His version of applause. The assistant whistles a tune. Off-key, cheerful. And someone outside calls out for bread. Time to serve again. Time to start again. But you're not tired. You're ready. Because you've learned how to sleep with your dough. And now you understand why. You're rolling dough again. Palms pressing, folding, turning it with a rhythm that's starting to feel like second nature. Your forearms are streaked with flour. Your knees ache slightly from standing. And still, you keep going. Because the work, while repetitive, has stopped feeling like labor. It feels meditative. And that's when the baker tells you something you didn't expect. Tonight's the festival bake, which means extra loaves, fancy shapes, decorative crusts, and yes, more sleep lost. You glance at the rising stack of baskets, already half full of shaped dough. The pace is picking up, not frantic, but deliberate. This batch isn't just about feeding bellies. It's about offering thanks, marking time, keeping tradition. There's an almost festive air in the bakehouse now. A second assistant arrives with a sack of finer flour. The baker brings out dried herbs, rosemary, lavender, sage. He hands you a tiny pouch of crushed fennel seed and says, "Use this in the crescent loaves." You nod because of course you do. You're part of this now. And here's your historical fact. In medieval Europe, feast days often came with special breads, not just because people liked treats, but because bread was how you marked the sacred. Easter brought braided loaves. Christmas came with spice. Some saints' days were honored with honeyed crusts or almond-topped rolls. In cities like Florence and Ghent, bakers made fig-shaped loaves to represent abundance or fertility. It wasn't just nourishment. It was ritual, story, symbol. You help shape the crescents, twisting them into spirals. One loaf has a cross scored on top. Another is dotted with dried currants. The smell is changing again, more fragrant, almost floral. The fire, too, is hotter now. More fuel has been added to handle the larger batches. The bakehouse hums like a living thing. And now it's time for something even stranger. The baker leads you to a corner cupboard, pulls out a flat wooden plank with small carved figures. Lions, birds, fish. He calls it the blessing board. You're told to press a shaped loaf onto the design, just gently, before baking. It leaves an imprint, an image, a prayer and crust. Your quirky tidbit? Some towns believed these images protected the bread from spoiling. Others said they could keep fire spirits from burning the batch. A few insisted the marks would scare off rats. But most simply believed they were beautiful and worth the effort. Historians still argue whether these designs were religious, superstitious, or just plain fun. There's no consensus. Just hundreds of boards tucked into museums still dusted with flour. You try it yourself, press a round of dough onto a carved boar, then lift it carefully. The shape holds. The snout and tusks peek through the flour. It's oddly satisfying. And now, you rest again. A shorter pause this time. Just long enough to sip water, wipe your brow, stretch your back. Outside, the street is quieter. The hour is turning. But you're not measuring it in clock ticks. You're measuring it in batches. The next tray goes in. Another one cools. The assistant hums again, this time a tune you recognize from the tavern. A drinking song. You raise an eyebrow. He grins and shrugs. "It keeps the bread warm," he says. You laugh, because humor is part of the rhythm too. Now let's peek beyond the bakehouse walls for a second, because for all the focus on flour and fire, baking didn't exist in a vacuum. It was part of a larger, bustling machine. The town's bell tower would ring to signal baking hours. The miller might deliver grain at midnight, trudging in with his mule and a lantern. A local woman might drop off herbs from her garden, payment for a loaf set aside earlier in the week. This was ecosystem baking. And you? You're not just making food, you're anchoring community. Here's something few people talk about. Many medieval bakers were also healers in a way. Not doctors, not midwives, but comforters. When someone died, you brought bread. When someone was born, you brought bread. When someone lost their harvest, or got married, or returned from war, you guessed it, bread. It was the language of empathy. The baker didn't need to know the details. He just needed to show up, warm loaf in hand, no words spoken. It makes you wonder, what do we hand out today when people hurt? A text? A meme? Back then, it was dough, salt, and warmth. And still, as the fire blazes and the bread cracks its final note, you realize something else. These loaves you're making tonight will outlive the shift. Some will be eaten tomorrow, some delivered before dawn. A few, perhaps the decorated ones, will be saved for Sunday, wrapped in linen, placed beside candles. You carry a new batch to the window rack. The air outside is colder now. Stars still pulse in the sky above the rooftops. And that's when you hear it. A soft tap-tap on the side door. The baker opens it. A woman stands there. She's older, wearing a shawl. She says nothing, just lifts a basket. The baker places a crescent loaf inside. She nods once, walks away. No money changes hands. You don't ask. You already understand. Because some bread isn't sold, it's shared. And now, back to the table. One more batch, one more rise. You're getting good at this. The assistant claps you on the back. The baker refills your cup. You smile, because this isn't just baking, it's belonging. The room is quieter now, not silent, but different, softer. You feel it in your shoulders, in the way your breathing has slowed. The bakehouse has entered its final rhythm of the night. The rush has passed. The festival loaves are stacked. The cooling trays are full. Even the oven, still glowing hot, feels less intense, like a fire that knows it's done its job. And you? You're still here, still rolling, still folding, but with a gentler pace. Not because you've slowed down, but because everything else has. The baker leans against the wall, arms crossed, watching the flames through the cracked oven door. The assistant is dozing in a corner, arms tucked into his apron. No one tells him to get up. It's part of the rhythm. You hear the steady tap of the baker's thumb against his palm, a counting habit. Maybe he's marking the minutes until the last loaf is ready. Or maybe he's just listening to the bread, to the fire, to the night. Because this, too, is part of baking. The waiting. Here's a historical fact to warm your sleepy brain. Many medieval bakers didn't have clocks, but they did have rhythms, and one of the most accurate was the psalm. That's right. Monks, nuns, and devout lay bakers would recite psalm verses to measure time. It wasn't about faith alone. It was functional. A certain psalm took approximately 7 minutes to speak aloud at a slow pace. 2 psalms? 14 minutes. Enough to turn dough, rotate loaves, or check on a rising batch. So instead of a timer, you'd have a verse. Imagine that. Instead of a beep, a whisper. Instead of a screen, a song. And here's your quirky tidbit for this round. There's a 14th century baker's guide from Flanders that suggests singing Ave Maria 3 times to mark the perfect souring of a rye sponge. The idea being, keep your hands moving, and your mouth too. Just not for complaints. Historians still argue whether these practices were universally followed or more common in religious settings. Some believe it was a teaching tool for apprentices who couldn't yet read. Others argue it was a kind of meditative practice, a way to keep mayat, harmony, even in the kitchen. You glance at the baker again, still watching, still silent. He's not checking your work anymore. He's letting you own it, because this too is part of the process. Letting go, trusting that the dough and the hands will do what they need to. You carry your final batch to the proofing bench, a long, stretched dough meant for tomorrow's early buyers. The rich golden crust will be perfect with cheese or dipped in wine. You mark the top with a simple line, your own quiet signature. Then you sit. There's nothing else to do but wait. Outside, the first hints of blue are starting to rise behind the rooftops. Not full dawn. Not yet. But the color has shifted. The night is loosening its grip. And now something small, but beautiful, happens. The baker rises, walks over to the shelf, and picks up a bundle of cloth. Wrapped inside is his own dinner, a flatbread folded around herbs, cheese, and yesterday's end crust. He breaks it in half, offers one to you. You take it without speaking. It's warm, a little chewy, salted just right, and it tastes earned. This is not just a snack. It's the shift's reward. Because back in the day, most bakers didn't eat fancy meals, but they did get first pick of the crust, the end pieces, the overbaked corners, a perk of the trade, a quiet luxury. And if you were lucky, the baker shared. That's what's happening now. No ritual, no words, just a quiet meal shared over the last loaf of the night. And here's something you didn't know you needed. There's a reason medieval bakers slept beside their dough. Not just for warmth, not just for timing, but because sometimes it was the only time they rested. Between batches, between deliveries, between the fire roaring and the customers knocking. So they slept curled near the flour sacks, cloaks tucked around their ears, dough rising beside them, fire glowing at their feet. Time wasn't stolen, it was borrowed. And now you're feeling it, aren't you? That steady exhale, that warmth in your stomach, that rhythm behind your ribs. This isn't just baking, it's a lullaby, one that's been sung for centuries in flour and flame and fatigue. The baker leans back. His eyes are closed now. Even the oven has dimmed. You wipe down the bench, hang the cloths to dry, stack the trays. All quiet now, all done. And just before you step outside, you glance back at the bench one last time. There it is, a single lump of dough, tucked beneath a folded cloth, rising, waiting, ready for tomorrow, because time never really stops here. It just stretches, breathes, bends with the warmth of a tired hand and a full heart. You walk out into the street. The sky is turning pale, and the smell of fresh bread clings to your skin like memory. You walk slowly down the cobbled lane, the sky now shifting from ink to dove gray. One or two shutters creak open. A rooster calls out, not quite punctual, but giving it a try. The town is yawning itself awake. And you? You're moving in the opposite direction, because your night is ending. And it ended with bread. The scent still lingers on your fingers. Yeast and ash, toasted grain, and a whisper of smoke. You pass a young boy carrying a basket. He nods to you with the kind of respect usually reserved for knights or stonemasons. But this morning, it belongs to the baker. And to you. Because tonight, you were one of them. The bakehouse fades behind you, its chimney still whispering a thread of white into the brightening sky. You pass the chapel, where a bell begins to toll the hour. Not the kind of sharp, aggressive clangs modern clocks give you, but slow, deliberate notes. A reminder, not a demand. 1, 2, 3. Time here doesn't push, it invites. You duck beneath a lintel into your borrowed room, the warmth of bread still tucked beneath your chest, like a second heart. You sit by the window and watch the first customers begin to trickle in, baskets swinging gently at their sides. One woman, wrapped in wool, is already cradling a round loaf in her arms like an infant. Another nods to the assistant as he opens the doors. No one shouts, no one rushes, because the rhythm is already in place. You lie down, finally. And for the first time in what feels like years, sleep doesn't feel like defeat. It feels like a reward, a good night's labor, a finished loaf, a shift well spent. Now let's drift back for a moment to that question from earlier. Why did medieval bakers sleep with their dough? Yes, it was timing. Yes, It was necessity. Yes, it was warmth. But deeper than that, it was presence. When you sleep beside the dough, you wake up with it. You feel its rise before the air moves. You sense its needs before it speaks. It's not a schedule. It's a relationship. One built not on clocks, but trust. And as the fire fades and the town begins to stir, you realize something. This wasn't just about baking. It was about living with time, not against it, in harmony, not resistance. You watched the dough rise slowly, not because you had no other choice, but because that's how it should rise. Gently, naturally, in its own time. You didn't slam it with speed. You coaxed it with care, like everything else worth doing. Now your eyes begin to close. The bed isn't soft, the pillow's a bit flat. But none of that matters. You're warm, you're full, and somewhere, down the road, the first loaf is being broken and shared, because you made it, not just with flour and fire, but with patience, with rhythm, with sleep beside the dough. Let your shoulders loosen. Let your breath stretch a little longer, like the folds of rising dough. You're not in the rush anymore. There are no notifications, no blinking screens, no timers demanding your attention. Just the quiet crackle of cooling crust, the slow exhale of an oven grown still, and the memory of soft flour brushing your fingertips. The stars may have faded, but their rhythm remains, in the turning of the earth, in the movement of time that asks nothing from you but presence. No kneading now, no lifting, no shaping, only resting. Because even the best bakers paused, even the busiest ovens cooled, and even the oldest breads were made better by letting them rise untouched, unhurried. So imagine the world slowing with you, the village dim, the fire warm, the last basket delivered, the bell now silent, the dawn stretching overhead, quiet as a cat's paw, light spilling gently across rooftops. And you are still. You are enough. You are, at last, off the clock. Let sleep take its time, just like the dough did. Let dreams come like soft loaves full of warmth and honey and old stone hearths. The baker's shift is over, and now, so is yours. Sweet dreams.